Okay, we're live. Hello, good morning, and happy Monday to everybody. We are back with my favorite people, and we're going to have a talk today in our Conversations Under the Bus. Our topic is supporting balance trainers who want to change. So we're going to get into the weeds of this a bit. So here's the preamble. So how can we support interested and keen people who actually care versus using trainers without falling prey to the manipulation of those who with no desire to change and learn, who are sort of, co-opting our sort of like our magnanimity. In this episode, we will be talking about the distinction between balance trainers seeking education, balance trainers with no interest in changing, and their seeking of legitimacy, and the confusion of dog owners navigating this landscape with their own dogs. How can we help those who genuinely want help and make transparent that not all are in this camp? So for the record, we think there is a difference between training with or without aversive stimuli, positive punishment and negative reinforcement, stuff like shock collars, prong collars, choke collars, shake hands, hitting, kicking dogs, and so on. Feels strange to have to spell this out, but there's a recent fad to blur it all together. There's this weak apologist argument going around, which is, well, if you've ever inadvertently bumped into your dog or stepped on his foot, you've used an aversive, so there's no meaningful distinction here. So we think that is an incredibly weak argument. Like Christy pointed out in one of our earlier panels, there are aversive-free trainers who are now making this argument, which is doing the propaganda work for the aversive trainers. And we think this is a really, really sad state of affairs. Like it's somehow more Gandhi-like to fail to advocate for dogs, but instead to advocate for people who electrically shock them. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is the only olive branch that we can extend to aversive using trainers, blessing them, and blessing something that we think is really not okay.
Yeah, I mean, so we talked about this, I think actually we touched on this in a previous episode, but for me, it's this very fine line between supporting someone who wants to cross over and knowing that that comes with somebody's going to move at their own pace. Not everyone, gets there at the same time, the same way, and enabling someone to continue causing harm. Like before we met today, we talked about this timeline, and Jean, you pointed out, like even 30 years ago, we knew that this has been going on a long time. This isn't new information. And so how long do we enable or allow someone to take their time to get to a force-free mindset?
If they've been doing it a long time, is that evidence that they don't want to change?
Right. And I'm all for allowing people to move at their own pace, but I'm not okay with another 30 years. I think we really there has to be some pressure, I think, put on people to start, making changes, because we can't wait around for 1, 2, 3, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 more dogs to be the guinea pigs for this, this timeline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there's got to be ways that we as dog training professionals and dog training educator professionals like Jean and I are to say, like, you're welcome to come into our space and learn without saying, what you're doing is okay. That we're humans, we have giant complex brains. Surely we can come up with messaging that sort of suggests, that we want to teach you, or we're happy that you want to learn, without being like, oh, and we love what you're doing to dogs. Hit the shock button again,
It's holding two ideas in our head, which is, we understand that change is difficult, and we understand that you're probably, a fine person, and, you would you're trying to do the what you think is right for dogs, and you're trying to save dogs and all that stuff. And we can hold that idea in our mind while also saying, but these practices are just not okay. And have that line be firm, not kind of dotted.
Yeah.
Lisa, I'd like to sort of bring up this, the mop-up squad idea. So there's this idea around that somehow if we used aversives, we would save more dogs, that we would keep more dogs out of shelters if only we would just, expand our toolbox, that somehow the non-aversive trainers are the ones who are, we'd rather see dogs medicated or dead than, have aversives. But in fact, the actual fact is that all day, every day, we are, getting people, owners who have gone to aversives trainers, had their dogs not helped, or in many cases made worse. And you're dealing with this every day. Am I right?
Oh, right now I'm booked out to November 21st for new consultations. I'd like to not be. And unfortunately, most of those consults are for folks who had, and I said this in a prior conversation that we had, most of those folks were people who started with nuisance behaviors, counter surfing, jumping on guests, that type of thing. And now they may not be counter surfing anymore. So perhaps that targeted behavior was suppressed. But what we are seeing is serious fear and aggression. Now they have a bite history. Now people can't come into their homes. That's when they come to me. And so for me, it's a difficult thing because in this particular community, it's very heavy aversives. I was thinking this morning about a colleague of mine who's retired, a local colleague, just a really lovely human being. And I remember her about 10 years ago reaching out, and it was this big deal. And she's the kindest person, reaching out to a very well-known long-term aversives dog trainer in our region, wanting to build a bridge, all of those things. And I don't know why I didn't think of this sooner. And she was, just extending an olive branch, so genuine, so kind. And the person, from what I understand, was very receptive to it in terms of having conversations, building a relationship. But she never changed because she makes about $500,000 a year shocking dogs. What's interesting is 10 years later, at least 10 years later, that poor colleague of mine is retired. But this woman is still shocking dogs. And she's still booked out 3 or 4 months in advance. And I'm booked out, 5 months trying to undo the damage of it. So my thought is, these folks that are very entrenched, very dug in, who are successfully making money. So why change is probably the likelihood of that. But I don't see them. They're not self-selecting to change. They're self-selecting to use coercion, to use violence. And those, by the way, are not subjective terms. Shocking a dog electrically, choking a dog, pinning them down, against their will, hitting, kicking, all of these things are categorically abusive. It's just that in the human population, when something like that happens to a human, there's legal ramifications. It's not subjective. It's not in the eyes of the abused or the victim. With dogs, they don't have that. They don't have the rights that humans have. So their sense of safety, their welfare is compromised, and apologetically so lately. So it's kind of depressing. But when somebody's choosing to use those methods, when someone's been approached and a conversation has been, it's incredibly inappropriate for me to first of all, expect that I'm going to change the mind of somebody who has all the available information and chooses to continue to use violence. But it's also a self-care issue because I work constantly. I'm booked out constantly because of those methods. So for me to even make an effort to reach out to somebody who has all the information but chooses to profit on the broken back of a dog is not, it's not helpful to keeping me in the business so that I can continue. So I have a bit of a different perspective, just being surrounded by unapologetic aversives trainers who know better, who know the information, who've been provided the information, and choose to continue, self-select to continue to use those tools and methods. It's not for me to try to change their minds. It's for me to try to undo the damage. So yeah, I have a very different perspective. And these clients are crushed, by the way. The clients are crushed when they come to us. They feel like they've done something wrong. And, we've all been there where we've got
that, it really is sort of like so trainers who are aware of the lay of the land, they're aware of the educational opportunities and so on, versus guardians of dogs who for generations have been given these just fantastically mixed messages about dog behavior, about dog training, about what they're supposed to do. I mean, it is such a quagmire for them. I love, Lisa, that you used the word violence. And we in human society, it's like crystal clear that it's very different to assault somebody Okay, so if you went up to somebody and tased them, electrically shocked them, versus you're in line at the coffee shop and you inadvertently step on somebody's toe, that those are so different. And the sort of the deliberate obfuscation is kind of just conflating those things together in an attempt to legitimize the versus training is what makes me want to just run screaming from the room. It really is. There's the versus trainers, and the ones who are adherent. So there's the ones who want to change. It seems to me that there are multiple buckets. I think we're going to talk about the gradations, that they're the people who just, they're looking to become a dog trainer, and they fall into the clutches of a fly-by-night school, versus a guardian, versus somebody who's been in the biz and knows that there's a difference. That those are the ones. And then there's, on our side, the people who are saying, what, we really would like people to cross over, and how best can we achieve that? Should it be via legal means? Is that going to be our only recourse? If education fails, then it's about, okay, let's make it illegal, put all our efforts into that, or flood the marketplace with good information, and then the market will squeeze them out. And where was I going? I was going somewhere with this. And then the people on our side who recently, so in the last few months, the people on our side who are saying it's all the same, and we shouldn't draw distinctions, and we should just, like, they're fine, and
not even
there's no such thing really as an aversive, and we're doing it anyway, so we kumbaya. Like, hang on a second, there is a difference. Like, do not gaslight us.
No, and to say that, abuse, you can't use terms like abuse and violence when it is categorically
knowingly, needlessly, electrically shocking an animal is abuse.
Right. You can do it. You just
on
can't
what
call it
planet?
Yeah,
on what planet? If the zoo was electrically shocking the giraffes, there'd be picketers. There'd be,
Imagine choking your learner if you're, you're a student in college, or you're a student in preschool, or wherever.
Wrong things around the arms of children. It's absurd.
Yep. And we'd call it abuse because it would be obvious. And the law, by the way, would call it abuse. Oleg had pointed that out. These are actually classifications by law. It's not subjective. Abuse is not subjective, depending on the person receiving the treatment. Plenty of people don't, I'll go into a rabbit hole. I won't say that. My point is, dogs have a right to a sense of safety. Dogs have a right. And if we're using violence and coercion, it is by definition abusive treatment of another being. And if that's what people are using with, by the way, all the science we need to know, and by the way, common sense that we need to know that that's going to result in a fearful dog. And then we also know that fear is that's what drives a lot of aggression.
Worst possible side effect. Having a clear line about this, does that preclude helping people cross over? In other words, that alienates the people, the aversive people. It's kind of like saying, we don't want to alienate, people who want to, molest children. Like,
it's a bizarre thing.
I mean, we do want to help people who are doing stuff, but we also need to say it's not okay what you're doing.
Right. And likening, saying, people who don't use violence in dog training, people who are, quote, force-free, that they're not force-free with human learners. Well, first of all, I'm certainly not choking and electrically shocking people who use tools that
words are not violence.
Right. Words are not violence. And having these conversations is important. And why aren't we having real conversations about it? Why instead are we pretending things are okay that are not? So I do have a concern with that. And it is confusing to clients.
And it is a
very different approach.
We should say it is a sort of a certain group. I mean, there's a certain sort of narrow subset of people who are trying to do all this blurring. For what purpose, I'm not sure. What are they sincerely thinking this is the way to do it? Are they looking for market share? Is it different motives for different ones of them? It's hard to understand that. Is it an attempt to look the most Gandhi-esque? So these gradations. So Christy, you were talking earlier about that there's some versus trainers seem to enjoy it. Some are sort of, sort of capitalizing on this new trend.
I think, like, if you're talking about how can we as non-aversive trainers, as force-free trainers, how can we educate or help, crossover trainers? I think that having an understanding that not every aversive using trainer is the same. And you know, in the sort of the notion of taking care of ourselves and our own mental health, we need to be able to pick, if we're gonna wade in, which we don't have to, but if we're gonna wade in, if we have that ability and desire and, you know, whatever, we need to sort of accept that, you know, we're going to be able to make a difference with some people and not with others. So being able to sort of identify and classify people, like I know at the academy, I certainly get emails and talk to people who are using aversives in their dog training and want to come into the academy. Therefore, you know, as a side effect, they want to change, right? They want to do better. And then I also talk to people who just want to bait me, you know, who email me, and sometimes they even like fake it a little bit. They're like, oh, well, I'm so curious about what you want to, you know, how would you handle this dog? And it's relatively obvious, you know, the difference. But I think sort of going, I'm not going to engage with the people who are just trying to argue with me for fun, you know, or who really are never going to change. And the people who
or they think they're going to they think you're going to catch you with
their
their ironclad arguments.
Yeah, and I don't. Maybe some people enjoy that. I don't know. I don't enjoy it, and I don't.
Yeah,
and so I just don't. Right. And so I would encourage our audience, if you are like, you know what, I want to get in there. I want to help people cross over, to just sort of recognize that the audience is very diverse of trainers who are using aversives right now, and we need to protect ourselves if we're going to wade in. And I think there's a bunch of ways, and we sort of are maybe going to talk about some of them. There's a bunch of ways to sort of protect ourselves and possibly make a difference. And sometimes that means engaging with these trainers if you want, and sometimes it means doing something else that helps to move the ball, if that's an appropriate sports ball metaphor, that helps to move the ball without having to actually have confrontations or discussions with people who are actively harming dogs, you know? So
yeah,
and
just kind of pushing their engagement stats, you know?
And like
It's funny.
some trainers, I've met trainers who are into various dog sports who legit don't really understand that there's this culture war. They use aversive tools, but they're literally kind of living, some of them, in a little bit of a bubble. Like they certain, oh yeah, I know that that's an issue and a thing, but they don't know how big of a thing it is.
Well,
or how big of a thing it was
they
in
live in a world. They live in a world where that is so normalized that, you know.
And so like they're willing to have conversations, you know, or they're, and they'll probably have some you know, mental pushback because they've been using these tools for so long, but still there's, like, I think grounds there, right? For there's grounds there for interesting conversations that will help people.
Yeah, so in the late 1980s, as soon as I, you know, really got my head around, that you can do it completely without, it was like, oh my God, all I need to do is help spread the word about this, and everybody will automatically cross over, because it's so self-evident that, you know, if there's a choice, you wouldn't do it. And now fast forward almost like 40 years. And so I oscillate between fight the fight, try to understand, protect myself, and then, you know, what, and then ponder what to do about this. You know, it seems like, you know, I need to undo the automatic assumption that anybody that's in this day and age not crossed over is they're tenaciously clinging to aversives, and then what to do about those people. And enabling, to me, the one thing I'm sure is enabling is not the answer for the tenacious holders. It's like a drug addict, you know, a drug addict who has no motivation to go to rehab, who's got a parent or somebody paying for everything, you know, bailing them out.
And I think, like, go ahead, Lisa, sorry.
And I was talking about the, you know, 25-year history of aversives trainer that is just entrenched, understands the information, and has zero, no impetus to change. I don't know if it's ethics or if it's just profit, or, you know, whatever it is. But recently I went to a workshop, and it was interesting. It was for fearful dogs. And there was a person there who self-selected to go to this workshop, spend real money, travel to go to this workshop, who was using prong collars, who was using aversives. She's a young gal, and she was just kind of starting out, you know, just been a trainer for a year or two. so receptive to
Oh.
the new information. So I do try to remember, because Jean, I'm like you, where I just have this there's
There are
this
days.
brain that thinks, well, if you're using them, you're doing it anyway, like you enjoy doing this. And,
Right.
it's a feeling, but then you will, for me, meeting this young gal who wanted information, who was really receptive, had tons of compassion, tons of empathy, who was just, she's young, she'd come in, this is
They're
how she
not all the same. Yeah.
Yeah,
She,
and
she
she's like,
fell
oh,
into
there's
the
this
wrong
stuff.
clutches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are people that are new to this that do learn. And I've got somebody in a class right now who came up in the show world and was using Aversives, loves dogs, and now has recently applied to KPA.
Yeah.
And is really excited about a new journey and learning more.
And hopefully not
They're
one of
out
these
there.
people is like, well, I want to get good at using positive reinforcement so that I can add it to my aversives toolbox so that I've got everything. This idea that more is better, that that it's not that we exclusively use aversives. Well, we know that.
Right.
Let's talk a little
Yeah.
bit about the science. And there's a couple of things. One is the science of persuasion. And the other little bit of science that I do want to mention is very clear findings that punishment is a intrinsically reinforcing event for humans, especially punishing in-group members who defect, or somebody who you're supposed to be cooperating with who defects. So there's really well-controlled laboratory research where it shows that somebody will actually incur a cost, so financial cost. So if they're doing a research thing where they're supposed to cooperate in order to they each get $10, but if you defect, you get 20, the other person gets nothing, but then you get the opportunity. People who are in with a partner who defects, who sort of takes all the money and doesn't cooperate with you, that if you then subsequently have the opportunity to incur a cost to take away their money, most people will do so. In other words, we have an instinct to make sure that so it's a reinforcing event for us. So if we think somehow in our minds that if dogs are defectors, so if dogs are doing stuff that they know they shouldn't do, or we need to sort of somehow corral that. And so when we stop a dog from doing something that is aggravating us or annoying us, that we get the rush of whatever chemicals it is that rewards us. And that's something that I think we shouldn't dismiss. That these people are getting whatever hits whenever they do that. And then somebody, let's talk about this. Okay, so how do we, the whole idea of how do you persuade people who aren't offering themselves up to be persuaded?
I think honestly, like I none of us, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, are super big experts on that. So I would say reach out and pay attention to the experts. Zazie Todd writes and does webinars through PPG about how to convince people, and how not to, right?
And being yelly is not one of the
getting on somebody's post and
venting is important. I mean, we should say that because
sure.
of the burnout and all, having a safe place to vent and a safe place to kind of say, wow, I'm so tired.
Yeah.
It's okay. But that's different from trying to change the world.
Yeah.
Engaging on posts with strangers about, and getting yelly about it. Very different.
Yeah. And I think so when I constantly look to her writing and try to improve my own messaging. And we did want to sort of stick it in there that if you can't, for whatever reason, engage with people who are using aversives, and you're a dog trainer who's a force-free dog trainer, that's great. You're
still doing great things by staying in the business and fixing being the mop-up squatter, fixing cases, or offering the alternative.
And you don't even have to comment. You don't even have to make posts about aversive tools. Just make posts and share information about good dog training. You are still fighting the fight, right? Or join a professional association that strongly and clearly has a line in the sand about aversive tools and
guild
participate there, like quietly. Those are still, you are still fighting the fight. You're still marching with us. Yeah.
And I think for like self-care, like what I've done on my page, because I am very vocal against the use of aversives on my page, which comes with a lot of, like Christy, you were talking about, like, people even trying to dupe, like they'll come onto the page and they'll say like, oh, I'm, I can almost tell when they're trying to bait me into a conversation. And like, newsflash, it's not my first rodeo. Like if you do that, we know what you're doing. But I've really had to come up with almost like a mission statement about what I will and won't do on my page. And so to save my own, and Jean, you talk all the time about, save the trainer. What I've done is I've decided that I won't argue. So my page is not the place to argue. I will, if you come on and you're advocating for the use of aversives, I will remove you from the page. I think there's lots of places on the internet for that to happen, and my page is not that. And for my own well-being, I've chose not to engage in that kind of conversation. So I think if you're someone who feels like you want to be involved, but you're worried, and every time I post, and this is really important, every time I post, I have people write to me who are forestry trainers who say, I'm so glad you're speaking up about this because I used to and I can't anymore because
I did that
got
to you
attacked.
years ago.
Yeah, my Emily's got
a message a few
Emily's
years
got
ago.
the uterus.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it gives my uterus is like fired up every time because I'm like, I got to do more of this because other people, and there are times where I am, too tired or I don't want to. And so I'm very careful about that. But I think it's okay to turn it on and off if you
Right.
feel today like you can post
And like
or
you
be
say, have
involved.
rules about how you're going to do it.
Yes.
When I,
and
when I
always
when I was in my
save the
period of I'm
trainer.
just going to be yelly, sort of in the 90s, and wrote the Culture Clash and stuff. It was just like, I'm just going to yell at them and they'll see how horrible it is and everybody will cross over.
How
Like,
wrong they are.
okay, maybe not. Okay,
Yeah.
and then it was like, yeah, burned out a couple of times, and then okay, I'm just going to educate dog trainers in how to do it really well, be super competent at doing it without aversives, help the market, and that will take care of the problem. But I think the multi-prongs, I think we don't know, and we're at the stage now in 2023 where the holdouts, what about the holdouts, like.
Right.
Yeah. I think the
Yeah.
idea of, like, Jean, what you're saying earlier about punishment being reinforcing, so doing punishment, meting out punishment is reinforcing to humans, I think is an interesting way to sort of like, for myself, for my own brain, instead of just being angry, to be like, wow, I bet that person is, but I think we can also, can we request that people do a little bit of self-anthropology? So if they're using aversive tools, to be like, hey, just so you know, this is the thing about us humans. I feel it too. I'm not saying I don't feel it. I make an effort to not do that because I know about, I've learned other dog training techniques, and I also don't want to do that to my dogs, right?
And they're swimming in a pond where the over and over they get the message chanted to them that those non-aversive trainers, they're not getting the job done. And it should be said, there are non-aversive trainers not getting the job done.
Topic for another day.
Yeah, that's a topic for another day. So the competence issue, being non-aversive is not enough. Okay, and that is a topic for another day. But they're swimming in a pond where that is one of the messages. The other message is that it's really not that bad what we're doing. Like, stop, demonizing it. They're used to it. In other words, they're habituated to it, and they're being told that simultaneously that it's not so bad, that it's also this last resort for the red zone, worst possible dogs. And so they get this messaging over and 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 over. And so it's hard for them to believe when we say, actually, you can get it all done. My first and foremost, my mantra in dog training is get the job done, get the problem fixed. And I am, in theory, I'm a Lima trainer insofar as if I had to, I would absolutely do it. But here's the thing, I haven't had to for 30 years now. And I've taken some pretty nasty ass cases. What is this telling us? And there's a whole bunch of people like me out there doing that.
You created a whole bunch of people like you.
Well, and they're out there anyway,
Right.
and doing more than what I ever did. So what does this tell us? So how do you account for that population of people?
Yeah.
I'm getting yelly, aren't I? Because
Good, I like it.
As long as, so one of the things that we did want to, I think another sort of miniature point we wanted to bring up is that if you do feel the need to get a little yelly, that's fine. We're here for it. But don't get yelly on somebody else's post, because that just gives them social media fuel, right? So if somebody's like, I love my shock collar, don't get on their post, Instead, do what Lisa does.
Cy Woolard was saying over and over, saying,
Yeah.
Fight the
Create
war on
your
your
own.
fight the war on your battlefield if you're
Yeah.
going to get into arguing on the internet,
Bring them to give you social media
Yeah.
juice if you can handle it, which
Yeah.
I personally couldn't do. I slash people
And
from
it
conversations
doesn't work, so
And I'm very careful too. Like, I think the other thing we have to point out is that, like, when I'm engaging with people who use these tools or these methods, and they're taking money from clients to hurt the dog, I am
and telling the client
very-
that it's not so bad and not disclosing the potential side effects.
Yeah, all of that.
Not
Yeah,
disclosing
they're-
the potential side effects. I'm going to go down fighting on that one.
I will hold professionals, and I'll use that term very loosely, very accountable. But when we're dealing with, and I think we all have had these clients, Lisa just talked about them. I have lots of clients many clients, more clients than I can tell you. And I think this is where part of my fuel comes from. They come into a session and they're crying, bawling, because they feel so much guilt for what the previous trainer has done to their dog. I'm not
we
going to
have them
come into
do.
that session and be, holding that. I'm going to support you. I'm not going to hold you accountable.
Right.
I'm not going to be rough on you or judge you.
The
I
clients,
get
the
it.
clients are the victims.
Yeah, but I do hold the so-called professionals more accountable. I think if you're taking money from someone to quote unquote train a dog, you should be held accountable. You should be pushed, and you should be. I'm open to being pushed. If one of you came to me and said, "Hey, I want to challenge you on something that you're saying or doing," it might be uncomfortable for me, but I'm
My
going
dog
to
is
be.
worse.
Yeah, education sometimes is uncomfortable, but I think it's just this fine line of being, how do we hold these trainers accountable without, we don't want to alienate anyone, but we also don't want to be passive either. So yeah, I don't know. It's just
It is so tough.
And I think it's not just like we don't want to alienate them, but we don't want to push them further into their shock collar corners too. And I just think is a danger when you, sorry, it's not.
I mean, we should say to them, I know you think you have to do this. I know you think it's okay. I know you think it's benign, but I swear to all the God, you don't have to do it. You can get the job done. You can also get it done pretty efficiently. You don't have to use any of those tools. So if you don't want to, or if you've got any qualms or queasiness about it, but you're pretty sure you have to, know that there is another way.
There is
And it's
another
funny
way,
'cause
and
owners
that's the
are
key,
so
right?
hard.
The big thing that I think we miss often is that the argument is that, well, it works. Yeah, it does work. I don't think it has the desired outcome that people think it does. There's a
The
difference
research
between
is coming down all the time. Like every year, there's
all
more
the
and more
time.
research, and
It
it's pretty-
suppresses the behavior. It's not what I think people think that it is. But regardless, there is a better way, and that's where the pressure needs to come in. Like, yeah, okay, fine. You use these tools, you do this training, but there is a better way. There's a kinder way. If your client is leaving a session crying, I really, really urge you to think about what you're doing. My clients have left crying, but not because I've done something to their dog or because they feel guilty because of what we're doing. I think the ones that I've dealt with are leaving crying because they're relieved, because they feel heard. That's what I want to have happen, not that my client is leaving crying because I picked up their dog and shook it by the collar and caused a lifetime of harm. So if your clients are leaving crying for the wrong reasons, like, please, please, please put yourself in an uncomfortable situation and, lean into some education or expand your views a little bit and just see what it might feel like to not use those tools. Be uncomfortable because, you
don't want to be the last person who held out until it's made illegal. You're the last crossover, I'm the last crossover in North America,
Yeah, good. That was
Lisa,
sad,
did we speak over you there for a second?
I don't know. I don't know. Sorry.
So
My
education
thoughts.
for dog owners that they don't have to do it. I mean, that seems to be a really good place to put legislation. Let's make this stuff illegal. Let's make sure dog owners are aware that they don't have to do this. Continue to mint competent trainers, and then versus trainers who are genuinely, sincerely interested and not just wanting to bait non-aversive trainers for sport. We
Yeah.
open arms
Yeah.
for those people.
Always.
So, and I think, Jean, you take in the academy, you take trainers who have previously used aversive tools, and I think even some people who
we
are
try to
currently-
gauge their sincerity, because if they're coming in just trying to, I want to get all the academy has to offer to add to my aversive tools, and then they're in our discussion forums and so on, and then they're out there flying our flag, that's a problem. I do not wish to subject my students to people who are just going to sit there in our discussion forums making lame arguments and stuff. And so that's tough. So when people do that, we do want to gauge their sincerity, and it's been hit and miss. Sometimes I think, okay, that person, ended up being entirely sincere, and other times not. So that's, that's just a tough one.
That's
But
hard,
we do,
yeah.
we do absolutely.
So
We
it-
entertain applications from people who are, in the process of crossing over.
Right. Right.
Good for
Any
them.
final thoughts?
I would like to.
Maybe we should end with, save the trainer, don't burn out. The most important thing I think that anybody who's a non-aversive trainer can do is try to not burn out, because there's still a great shortage of competent non-aversive trainers. And so every person doing that job needs to protect, make sure that they're engaging in good self-care. And that might include not arguing.
Yeah. And so if you are somebody who is a force-free trainer and you can't engage, that's fine. There is no need for you to enter into these conversations. It's absolutely not a requirement of being a good
Or even
trainer.
talk about it. Yeah.
No, you don't have to. Just do good work with dogs and celebrate in your joyful practice with dogs, seriously. But if you feel fired up, then, use good human behavior change science, which exists, which we know, so seek out that science rather than wading in and start coming out yelling, first. And then also I think it's acceptable to sort of understand that there's going to be gradations, and that putting your energy into people who legitimately are interested to learn better practice rather than people who are entrenched, having especially big public conversations with people who are really entrenched and are harming dogs all the time with their tools, and who aren't interested in changing, having conversations with them where you don't make a case for non-aversive training, it's not useful. And in fact, it's damaging to the general sort of ethos of dog training at this point.
Yeah, please stop this freaking enabling stuff. It's so not helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you guys. Thought-provoking as usual. This is a very fraught topic, and thank you for the willingness to do this today.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.